great, wonderful, yeah, let's have him on Top of the Pops. Who's in the band? Johnny Rotten? Oh, cancel.
Johnny Rotten, the sneering prophet of punk rock, the man who turned snarling into an art form.
There is no future in England's dream.
The voice that screamed, "No future," and meant every word. But if you thought his public persona was aggressive, wait until you hear about his private vendettas.
So what? Am I not entitled to do what I want with my own body? I think I am.
This wasn't just stage rebellion. Rotten waged personal wars against musicians he deemed unworthy of breathing the same air. Behind those wild eyes and that trademark sneer lay one of music's most vicious critics, a man who could demolish entire careers with a single devastating putdown. From dinosaur rockers he wanted extinct to punk pretenders he considered frauds, from new wave sellouts to prog rock pomposity that made his skin crawl. We're exposing the 6 bands that triggered Johnny Rotten's most savage attacks, and the #1 spot reveals a betrayal so brutal it destroyed friendships and changed punk history forever. This isn't your typical rock rivalry. We're diving into the twisted psychology of punk's most notorious antagonist. Prepare yourself for some seriously toxic takedowns from the King of Chaos himself. 6. Pink Floyd. Kicking off our list. Pink Floyd, the psychedelic titans whose cerebral soundscapes and conceptual pretensions made Rotten physically ill. Rotten's war against Floyd began during punk's early days when their massive success represented everything he wanted to destroy about rock music. He viewed their extended instrumental passages and philosophical lyrics as the ultimate in self-indulgent garbage.
Criticizing something as sacrosanct as Pink Floyd, I mean, they were the royal family of music.
Once describing Dark Side of the Moon as background music for people too boring to have actual thoughts. The assault intensified when Pink Floyd's The Wall became a cultural phenomenon. Rotten saw Roger Waters' rock opera as peak pretension, telling journalists that the band had disappeared so far up their own conceptual backsides that they'd forgotten music was supposed to move people, not lecture them. He particularly despised their elaborate stage productions, calling them therapy sessions for rich musicians having midlife crises. What really triggered Rotten's rage was the reverence with which critics and fans treated Floyd's artistic statements. He couldn't stomach the idea that boring, self-important noodling was being hailed as profound, telling one interviewer that Pink Floyd was proof that audiences will worship anything if you make it long and confusing enough. The nuclear moment came when someone suggested that the Sex Pistols and Pink Floyd both pushed musical boundaries. Rotten's response was legendary. He reportedly went into a screaming rant about how Floyd represented everything punk existed to annihilate, describing them as musical Valium for people afraid of feeling anything real. His contempt for Floyd wasn't just musical. It was cultural warfare against what he saw as baby boomer complacency, disguised as artistic sophistication. 5. Genesis. At number 5. Genesis, whose theatrical evolution from prog rock complexity to pop accessibility earned them a special place in Rotten's Hall of Shame. Rotten's loathing for Genesis began during their Peter Gabriel era, but reached peak toxicity during Phil Collins' commercial transformation. He saw their journey from complicated concept albums to radio-friendly hits as the perfect example of artistic prostitution.
Being a rebel is. What are you rebelling against? You're just a pile of...
Once describing Collins as a singing accountant who turned rock and roll into elevator music. The venom flowed freely when Genesis achieved massive MTV success in the 80s. Rotten viewed their slick videos and polished productions as everything punk had fought against, telling reporters that Collins had sanitized rock music for people who find actual rebellion too uncomfortable. He particularly hated their sincere, emotional ballads, calling them fake tears for people who've never experienced real pain. What pushed Rotten over the edge was Genesis's mainstream respectability and critical acceptance despite their commercial pandering. He couldn't understand how the same industry that initially rejected punk embraced what he considered corporate rock disguised as artistry, describing their success as proof that mediocrity sells better than honesty. The final explosion occurred when Collins made comments about music's power to heal and unite people. Rotten's counterattack was merciless. He suggested that Genesis represented the death of rock's dangerous spirit, arguing that their feel-good messages were lies told by millionaires to people too weak to face reality. Rotten's assessment of Genesis was both musical and moral. He viewed them as traitors to rock's rebellious essence, selling out everything that made the medium vital for comfortable mainstream acceptance. Number 4 brings us to Fleetwood Mac, whose polished California sound and personal soap opera dynamics disgusted Rotten on multiple levels. Rotten's disgust with Fleetwood Mac centered on their transformation from blues rock authenticity to pop perfection with rumors.
No, they're not. Everything is mediocre and pleasant train journeys.
He saw their personal dramas turned into commercial gold as the ultimate in narcissistic self-indulgence, once describing the album as rich people's relationship problems disguised as universal truths. The hostility exploded when rumors dominated charts worldwide while punk struggled for recognition. Rotten viewed their mainstream success as proof that audiences preferred comfortable dysfunction to genuine rebellion, telling journalists that Fleetwood Mac was therapy music for people who think expensive problems are more interesting than real ones. What particularly nauseated Rotten was the band's ability to transform their internal conflicts into mass appeal entertainment. He saw their public airing of romantic difficulties as calculated manipulation of audience sympathy, describing their approach as emotional pornography for people living vicariously through celebrity breakups. The breaking point came when Lindsey Buckingham made comments about the band's emotional honesty and artistic vulnerability. Rotten's response was characteristically brutal. He suggested that Fleetwood Mac's version of honesty was privileged whining packaged as profound insight, and that their emotional revelations were calculated confessions designed to sell records. Rotten's ultimate condemnation focused on what he saw as their fundamental dishonesty, using personal pain as marketing strategy while living lives of luxury that insulated them from the real consequences of the emotions they were selling. 3. The Clash. Landing at number 3, The Clash, whose political posturing and musical expansion represented the ultimate punk betrayal in Rotten's twisted worldview. This rivalry cut deep because the Clash were supposed to be punk allies, part of the same movement that rejected mainstream rock conventions.
I did a lot of good favors for Joe. I gave him a career when he was a tosspot.
But Rotten quickly grew to despise what he saw as their calculated rebellion and fashionable politics, describing them as art school revolutionaries playing dress-up for middle-class kids who wanted to feel dangerous. The conflict erupted when the Clash began incorporating reggae, ska, and world music influences into their sound. Rotten viewed their musical experimentation as pretentious betrayal of punk's raw simplicity, telling reporters that Joe Strummer was trying to turn punk into a sociology lecture with guitar accompaniment. What really triggered Rotten's wrath was the Clash's commercial success and critical acclaim in America, territory he felt belonged to more authentic punk voices. He resented their ability to package rebellion for mass consumption while maintaining street credibility, once describing their success as proof that Americans prefer fake revolution to real anarchy. The nuclear moment occurred when the Clash made statements about punk's responsibility to address social issues and political consciousness. Rotten's counterattack was devastating. He argued that their political messaging was middle-class guilt disguised as working-class anger, and that their revolutionary posturing was performance art for people too comfortable to risk anything real. Rotten's final verdict on the Clash was both personal and philosophical. He saw them as everything wrong with punk's commercialization, transforming genuine nihilistic fury into marketable political fashion for suburban rebels. 2. The Rolling Stones. Claiming the number 2 spot, the Rolling Stones, whose continued existence in the punk era represented everything Rotten wanted to obliterate about rock's past. Rotten's campaign against the Stones was generational warfare disguised as musical criticism.
I'm retired. That's not me. I'm not that kind of person. By all means, the Rolling Stones should retire.
He saw their persistence as living fossils blocking space for newer, more vital voices, once describing them as museum pieces who forgot to die when their time was up. Their continued popularity particularly galled him, as he viewed it as audiences clinging to safe nostalgia rather than embracing punk's dangerous future. The assault intensified when the Stones attempted to incorporate new wave and punk influences into their late 70s output. Rotten saw these efforts as pathetic attempts at relevance by aging rockers, telling journalists that Mick Jagger was a pensioner trying to steal energy from his grandchildren's music. What really pushed Rotten to fury was the Stones' maintained status as rock royalty while punk struggled for mainstream acceptance. He couldn't stomach the idea that tired old blues recycling was still being treated as vital music, describing their continued success as proof that audiences prefer familiar decay to fresh creativity. The thermonuclear moment came when Jagger made comments about rock music's evolution and the value of experience in performance. Rotten's response was legendary. He suggested that the Stones represented rock and roll's corpse, refusing to stay buried, and that their longevity was proof that death would be an improvement. Rotten's hatred for the Stones wasn't just musical. It was existential warfare against rock's established hierarchy and his belief that they were literally preventing punk's rightful ascension to cultural dominance. 1. Public Image Ltd. His own band. The most shocking revelation, Johnny Rotten's greatest hatred was reserved for his own post-Pistols project, Public Image Ltd., and the musicians who dared to challenge his artistic vision. This self-destructive fury emerged when PL members began asserting their own creative input, instead of simply executing Rotten's commands. He had formed the band to escape the Sex Pistols' chaos, but found himself trapped in new conflicts with musicians he initially trusted, leading to a toxic cycle of collaboration and betrayal. The poison began flowing when guitarist Keith Levine and bassist Jah Wobble started receiving critical praise for their innovative contributions to PIL's sound. Rotten, accustomed to being the sole focus of attention, reportedly became paranoid that his bandmates were plotting to diminish his role or steal credit for the band's artistic achievements. What transformed creative differences into personal warfare was Rotten's discovery that band members were making musical decisions without his approval and speaking to journalists about their own artistic goals. He viewed any independent action as mutiny against his leadership, telling friends that his own musicians were trying to turn my band into their democracy. The final explosion occurred when financial and creative disputes led to massive lineup changes throughout PIL's history. Rotten's pattern of hiring musicians, growing to hate them, and then firing them became legendary in the industry, with former members describing him as impossible to work with and paranoid about losing control. The psychological damage was profound. Rotten's inability to maintain stable creative relationships with his own hand-picked collaborators revealed the self-destructive paranoia that would define his post-Pistols career, making him punk's most successful and simultaneously most isolated figure. Johnny Rotten's talent for destruction extended far beyond these 6 targets. He had venomous words for virtually everyone in rock history. From progressive dinosaurs to his own creative partners, Rotten's standards were impossibly high and his patience absolutely zero. Which victim of his verbal warfare caught you off guard? Drop your thoughts below and hit subscribe for more tales of rock's most unhinged personalities.